Hi everyone, it's Kelly here. Welcome to my channel if this is your first time visiting. Welcome back if you've been before. Lovely to have you either way. On this channel we talk books, and today I am wrapping up the month of August. I can't believe it's September already. This year has just gone so fast. Anyway, I had a pretty good reading month this month in August, relying very heavily on audiobooks to get me through because for some reason the eyeball reading brain, part of my brain just wasn't cooperating this month. I've done a bit of eyeball reading, but nothing that I've finished. Every single book that I've got to show you today is a book that I read on audiobook, which I have no problem with. Got no problem with it. Love it. Love an audiobook. Audiobook is a great way to read. So if you haven't tried it, you definitely should. And something that I like to do when I am reading via audiobook is I like to follow along in the physical copy of the book. So if you haven't given that a try, maybe that's something that you might want to give a go. All right, so let's get straight into it. I've got 5 books to show you this month that I read via audiobook and physical copy, and I'm excited to start talking about them. So let's just get straight into it. All right, the first book that I finished in the month of August was The 7 Husbands of Evelyn Hugo. I know, it took me 1,000 years to get to this book. Everyone else has already read it. It's by Jenkins Reid, but I have finally finished reading this book. What did I think about it? I thought this book was actually just okay. Don't come for me if this is your favourite. I'm so sorry. It just wasn't as much for me as I thought it was going to be for me. So in this book, in case you've been living under a rock and you've somehow managed to get through without hearing about it, is about a big Hollywood movie star from, decades before, in the era of Hollywood movie stars, who has lived a life that is intriguing to many people. She's this sort of bombshell of a woman that if you are into women, you want to be with her, and if you are a woman, you want to be like her. She's just this beautiful woman, but who is sort of enigmatic in many ways because people don't really know about her life. And we have our protagonist, this person who is narrating this story, is a journalist who, via some circumstances, ends up being invited to write the biography of Evelyn Hugo. And so we sort of cut between listening to that story of like how that came to be and sort of the interaction between the journalist and Evelyn Hugo, and then we cut to Evelyn telling her story. So I had mixed feelings about this because the Evelyn Hugo parts were really interesting, but the parts with Monique, who is the journalist, I found Monique to be a bit of an insipid kind of character. I didn't really like her as a character, and those aspects of the story were less interesting to me. It sort of felt like that if this book had just been the Evelyn Hugo story, I would have loved it. I loved it. It would have been, right up there in terms of favourite books, I think. But because of this other part of the story, I feel like it really did feel like it was just the vehicle for the Evelyn Hugo story, which was sad because it just didn't quite work for me as well as I had hoped. And especially with, so many people loving this book and seeing it as up there with their favourite books, I really had high hopes for it, but it didn't quite live up to those. I didn't hate it though. I gave it 3.5 stars. But yeah, it was definitely worth sticking it out. I'm glad that I've now read it. I'm in 2 minds as to whether Jenkins Reid is going to be an author for me, because this is the first book of hers that I've read. So let me know, is this the best one? Because I've kind of got the impression that this is the best one from the internet, but if it's not, let me know, because I have a couple of her other books that I own a copy of but haven't had a try of yet. So let me know if there's anyone in particular that you think I should try, given that this one didn't quite work for me in the way that I had hoped. So anyway, I'm glad to have this off my TBR. It's been sitting there for far too long, so yay for me for for getting there. But yeah, not as impressive as I had hoped it was going to be. All right, the second book that I read this month was Foster by Claire Keegan. This is a tiny, tiny little book. Again, I listened to this one on audiobook, and then because I enjoyed it so much, I decided to buy myself a copy. So I didn't actually read this one at all with my eyeballs. I just listened to it. And I read another Claire Keegan book, the name of which escapes me right at this moment. I'll put it up on the screen. And I might also just link to where I reviewed that book as well. No, I can't think of it. That's okay. I'll put it on the screen. And I really, really loved it. So I was keen to read more Claire Keegan because it was her writing is just amazing. And this book did not disappoint. The story is told from the perspective of a child who is sent to live with a couple that she sort of doesn't really know for the summer, I think it is. Like, so it's, you know, between, I guess, just while the holidays, school holidays are on, she goes to live with this couple and sort of forms this bond with them. And, you know, it's sort of seeing things from her perspective, which when you have children as narrators, it's a mixed bag for me in terms of how much I enjoy that kind of a story, because often an author can write a child character in a way where their naivety of being a child, it just comes across as being, you know, a bit stupid and a bit like just annoying. But not so here. This was a really well written child narrator. And it's a really interesting story. I think one of the things that Claire Keegan does really well and is so masterful at is that sort of prose that is very spare. You know, so you as the reader are doing a lot of the work of kind of filling in the blanks, especially in this case where you've got a child that's narrating. So therefore, you know, you as the adult reading this book are kind of bringing your own knowledge of the world to your reading of it. And I really appreciate about that. I think she does that really, really well. Beautifully drawn characters as well, as always. But, you know, somehow, you know, with that, the sparsity in her prose, it is also still somehow such a vivid portrait of people and of a place at a time. So yeah, this is highly recommended from me. I gave it 4.25 stars. Fantastic book, yet again, by Claire Keegan. The third book I read was another very popular internet sensation type of book, and that is Book Lovers by Emily Henry. This one I adored. It was actually amazing, and I don't know what my expectations were of it. I've heard mixed things about Emily Henry, and this is the first Emily Henry book that I've read. I'm not always a huge romance reader. I've read a few romance books. I'm often really disappointed with a romance book where the dialogue is really cheesy or the situation that they find themselves in just doesn't really seem believable. But I think this book does a really good job of kind of creating circumstances that are plausible while still being kind of whimsical at the same time, which I like the things being whimsical, but it has to be believable at the same time. Is that too much to ask? I don't think it is, because this book exists. So in this book, we have a character who works in publishing, and she is, I believe, an agent, if I'm remembering correctly. She is known as being sort of this like ballsy kind of character who, you know, takes no nonsense from anyone, and is, you know, tough to deal with, but is also like a really great at her job and someone that people like to work with as a client because they know that she's going to go into bat for them. And her love interest, I guess, is another person in publishing who is an editor who has a somewhat similar reputation of being prickly to work with, but like really, really good at his job. So the circumstances in which they kind of come together is that they end up being in this small country town at the same time for an extended period of time, and end up sort of crossing paths and interacting there in a way that kind of differs from their first interaction that they've had as colleagues, which does not go super smoothly. That happens right at the beginning of the book. And then things obviously change as the book goes on. Look, it's a romance. You know where it's kind of eventually heading, but the route via which it heads there keeps you guessing, and it kind of takes twists and turns that you're not necessarily expecting. I also thought that the other characters that in this book were really, really fun, and you know, the sister of the main character is a great character also. I laughed so hard at parts of this book, like proper out loud laughed. I also, particularly some of the banter between the two main characters, I thought that the lovers were, you know, perfect, well suited to each other, with really, really good chemistry, like believable chemistry. I also thought that, you know, the book was also quite self-aware of itself in the romance genre, and kind of flipped some tropes on their head, as you know, while leaning into other tropes from the romance genre. I loved this. It was great. I gave it 5 stars. It was a fantastic read, and I highly, highly recommend. The third book that I read was a memoir, and it is Stanley Tucci's memoir, Taste My Life Through Food. This book was also amazing, delightful, one might say, and Stanley Tucci's personality and humour really shine through, especially as he reads the audiobook himself. So, you know, and it really does come through, his little asides said in his voice, you know, really, really, I would recommend listening to this one as an audiobook. And, you know, as his personality and humour shine through, as I said, as much as his love of Italian food in particular, but food in general. This was just, it was delightful. I highly recommend, 5 stars from me. If you haven't already read this one, I would recommend. All right, and the last book that I read this month was a book that I picked up recently. I haven't even hauled it yet in a video because I bought it in the month of August and then I read it in the month of August, which does not happen very often, let's just say, which if you've been following me for some time, you may or may not have noted. But the book is The Benevolent Society of Ill-Mannered Ladies by Alison Goodman. Alison Goodman is an Australian author. I was not aware of her work before, but I was intrigued by this cover, which is beautiful and interesting to look at, and intriguing in the sense of, you know, what is this going to be about? But so I was drawn to the cover, then I read the blurb and I was like, yeah, this sounds like the kind of book that I would be really into. And it is I would call it a historical fiction, kind of like a historical romance, I guess. You could call it a historical romance. But the spice level in this one, unlike the Emily Henry, where the spice level was relatively high-ish, this one is like very low. So this book reminded me so much of Georgette Heyer, and if you are a Georgette Heyer reader, especially her Regency novels, this is like very like that. It had the same sort of vibes. It's set in the Regency period. The characters have that, you know, the feisty Georgette Heyer kind of character traits that we've come to know and love if you're a Georgette Heyer fan. However, unlike Georgette Heyer's heroines, who are usually in their like early 20s, the heroines in this book are in their 40s, which is a departure, let's just say, from the genre, because these guys are unmarried women in the Regency period who have money. They're very privileged people. However, they are using their privilege for good, let's just say. And there are within this book, there are kind of 3 adventures that they go on. And what I really liked was it felt very episodic in the sense that one adventure kind of finishes and then the next adventure begins, but with the kind of thread throughout of the characters and sort of more general stuff that they're going through in their lives, and, you know, how they're connecting with one another and their relationships are growing and evolving. This was amazing. I loved this so much. It was so, so good. And if you haven't heard of this one, and you are someone who likes a historical fiction, particularly with a little bit of a romance bent, but not too heavy on the spice, this would be absolutely perfect. Even if you do like spice, I would still recommend, because the tension in this one is still pretty good. But there's definitely, I think, the romance is almost like secondary to these characters just sort of being who they are, having opinions at a time when that was not welcome, and finding people who love them and want to be in their vicinity, not despite who they are as people and how their opinionated nature and their intelligence and humor, but because of those things. So in that way, it's definitely something that felt like empowering, I guess. I will say, I ended up giving this on 4.5 stars, not a full 5 stars, although I loved it. It was really, really good. But there were a couple of moments where, and this happened, I talked about this in my last wrap-up, where we have situations where modern thinking, when we have a historical novel set in a historic period, modern thinking that comes through in a way that feels not forced exactly, but obvious, I guess, and it pulls you out of the story a little bit. So that did happen occasionally, not as much as the book that I was talking about last month, but so therefore this one I think worked better in that way. However, it did happen, so be aware of that. And I think the other thing that happened was, and again, this is a pitfall of writing in a historical period, is the research comes through in a slightly obvious way sometimes. You know, where there's like a very obvious insert of something that the author has clearly researched about the period, and it's not integrated in the story in a way that is sort of integral to the story. It's like, I'm putting this little detail in here so that it feels of its time, appropriate to the period. You know what I'm talking about. So very occasionally it happened throughout this book that would occur, and it's just one of those things that, for me anyway, just kind of slightly pulls me out of the story a little bit and makes it a bit harder for me to kind of remain in the story. However, those moments were definitely few and far between. And the action of the story, as well as the fact that it's episodic, so it sort of felt like the tension would build, somewhat resolve, and then would build again and somewhat resolve. That really worked for me really well, and the sort of adventures that they go on and the situations they find themselves in were very interesting and intriguing, and you were wondering the whole time like how they're going to get out of this situation that they've found themselves in. So this was really, really great, and I would highly recommend, if you haven't come across this one or you haven't come across this author, I'm definitely going to seek out more. And also I should say, there was definitely space at the end for there to be a sequel, and I did have a quick look online to check, and I believe one is planned. So, but this has only just come out this year, so I don't know how long we have to wait for the second one, but this is definitely a series that I'm going to continue when the next one comes out, and I'll be looking forward to. All right, so that is my reading month. Let me get my little stack. Here it is, my 5 books of the month. A really positive reading month for me, and you know that it's good when the worst book you read of the month was still a 3.5 star read that was still pretty enjoyable. So, you know, 2 5-star reads, a 4.5 and a 4.25 and a 3.5. Like, this was a great reading month for me, and I'm really glad that I got to a couple of books that have been sitting on my TBR for far too long, and have finally read those, especially given that one of them, Book Lovers, ended up being a 5-star read for me. That was fantastic to find that I really got along very well with Emily Henry's writing. Thanks so much for watching, guys. I will catch you on the next one. Bye!